So your GCSE English Literature exam is fast approaching and you need that last minute ultimate revision guide to JB Priestley's An Inspector Calls. I'm going to give you the quotations that I would use, go into more detail than ever before on characters, themes, and just explore what makes this a fascinating play and a great one to write about to get that top grade. Stay tuned, Schofield on Shakespeare.
Abbiamo il cuore a strisce, portaci dove vuoi.
Dear Mr. Arthur Birling, it's so easy to be critical of him, but let's try to be fair. He is not like his public school and varsity son and had a more working class upbringing, with less money and time for idling. Yes, his trumpeted comments about his approach to business are irritating and intended by Priestley to be critiqued, but he clearly knows his business inside out. Hence his ability to recall the average rate of pay for his factory workers, how much they wanted, and the impact on his labour costs. I think it's also important to note that although he disagrees fundamentally with the inspector's views on the world and society, he is not wholly unreasonable and sometimes acknowledges the logic at what his socialist counterpart is saying. He also clearly wants what he sees as the best for his own family. He wants to protect both his children and even tries to bribe the inspector post-revelations with what would have been an enormous sum of money. However, there is no question that Priestley wants the audience to dislike and ideally despise Mr. Birling from a very early point in the play. He is clearly someone who smugly relishes his position of power and respectability within Brumley, and will shamelessly name drop in order to curry favour with Gerald, and when trying to intimidate the inspector. His laughable complacency about future peaceful prosperity makes him seem stupid, whilst his inability to empathise with his workers and see them as real people repulses. He doesn't seem to understand his son and frequently patronises and puts him down. His jingoism is particularly unappealing to a modern audience. His insensitivity is also seen towards the end of the play, when he imitates the inspector in his final speech and points at Sheila and Eric whilst laughing. "You all helped to kill her." Even if it is true that the whole story is just a lot of moonshine, such behaviour seems desperately crass and misjudged, given that the revelations of the evening should have given a heartbreaking insight into the difficulties experienced by the less fortunate. Nonetheless, we do need to put Birling's behaviour in context, given that he himself is likely to have experienced class tension when courting his own wife, and this is an explicit addition to the BBC 2015 version of the play, and given the importance of marriage to a young woman in both 1945 and 1912, is there any wonder that he is in celebratory mood about Sheila's engagement to Sir George and Lady Croft's son? and wants to preserve this at all costs. The timing is certainly not perfect for the inspector's lesson, which is, of course, partly the point. I'm talking as a hard-headed, practical man of business. Oh well, put like that, there's something in what you say. If I'd agreed to this demand for a new rate, we'd have added about 12% to our labour costs. We were having a nice little family celebration tonight, and a nasty mess you've made of it now, haven't you? Imitating Inspector in his final speech, you all helped to kill her, pointing at Sheila and Eric and laughing.
The sun is at my windows, going home, the birds sing at my door. Going home is all I've ever wanted.
The Sybilkins, and I have to say there is painfully little to like here. She is of a higher class than her husband, and as such knows the critical importance of social proprieties. People need to know their place, with the vast majority of such people being below her, and worthy of nothing more than cold condescension. During his lengthy stage directions at the beginning of the play, Priestley is at pains to emphasise that the general effect of the dining room is not cosy and homelike, and we can't help but feel that this lack of warmth and ease stems from her. As the woman of the house, her role is to help set the domestic tone and atmosphere. Her priority is perhaps best summarised by this screenshot from the BBC 2015 production. Standards, Eric. Mrs. Birling is a woman who likes to remain composed and in control at all times. Hence her reluctance to drink port, even during such an auspicious occasion. She feels it is her duty to bring up her children to observe social niceties, and will upbraid them if she feels they're not quite speaking or behaving appropriately, even though both Sheila and Eric are in their 20s. She believes that well-brought-up women should confine themselves to the domestic sphere and firmly close their eyes and ears to any unpleasantness. She expects her children to obey her and accept her received unthinking wisdom. Out of all the characters, she is the most obdurate in her dealings with the inspector. Generally evasive in her replies, she maintains to the end that she was not only doing her duty in turning down Eva Smith's request for help, a decision seemingly triggered predominantly not by facts, but a feeling that the young woman was being impertinent by adapting the surname Birling. Mrs. Birling is too self-absorbed and narrow-minded to understand her children particularly well. For instance, she is staggered to learn about the extent of Eric's drinking. That said, I wonder whether some of this reaction is for the benefit of the inspector. A well-bred, respectable, high-class mother would never have known about the extent of a dependent's drinking problem without acting decisively. And certainly in both the 2015 BBC production and the version from 1954, Mrs. Birling is aware that Eric has some issues with his drinking. She is also clearly unaware of the extent of male, outwardly respectable middle-class hypocrisy in relation to sex outside marriage, gasping at the revelations about Alderman Megati and having no inkling whatsoever about Eric's sexual activity. So much so that she unwittingly ends up condemning him to severe public punishments. There are hints that Mrs. Birling may not fully understand her daughter either. She was against Sheila trying on that fateful dress in Millwoods, and one interpretation of this might be that this contributed to the spoilt brat daughter being more willful, more perversely determined, thus potentially contributing to Eva Smith's dismissal. Certainly the BBC 2015 production develops this idea beyond the text. Look at Sheila's irritation here as she effectively asks her mother to get lost. It is also notable that when Gerald returns to the house late on in the play, it is Mrs. Birling who answers his question about whether this is okay. Surely this question is predominantly aimed at Sheila, or should be, his former fiancée, who has just learnt that he spent a number of months keeping a mistress in a friend's flat, a mistress who would go on to kill herself. So this is a woman who is also sure of herself, and thus it is unsurprising that, like her husband, she is incapable of rethinking her perspective on the world following the inspector's visit. Why on earth should she change? Her children are simply overtired and will be as amused as them in the morning. Nothing but morbid curiosity. Staggered. Well, really, Alderman Meggerty, I must say we are learning something tonight. First, she called herself Mrs. Birling, a piece of gross impertinence, quite deliberate. And he ought to be dealt with very severely. They're overtired. In the morning, they'll be as amused as we are.
Is at my windows, going home, the birds sing at my door. Going home is all I've ever wanted, so I can see you once more. Going home, my heart is filled with longing. Going home, the sky.
Mrs. Birling seems to me the least likeable of all the characters on stage. If she is the villain, does that make Sheila the heroine? Well, the initial stage directions seem to hint otherwise, with Priestley observing that she is very pleased with life. A rereading of the play might suggest that Priestley actually means that, given the poverty and unhappiness surrounding her, she is too pleased with life. The revelations about the extraordinarily petty, vindictive way she insisted on Eva Smith being dismissed from Millwoods suggest that Eric was spot on with his pre-toast statement about her temper. And indeed, she herself seems to back this up. Yet she does clearly have some kind of conscience, which emerges even before any significant manipulative pressure from the inspector. She admits to feeling terrible about getting Eva Smith sacked, and fully accepts, unlike her parents, that her actions contributed to the death of a vibrant, vulnerable, beautiful individual. Her insistence in finding out the truth, however unpleasant and personally humiliating, contrasts sharply with her mother's blasé, closed-off haughtiness. Indeed, she grows in maturity during the course of the play, moving from sarcastic barbs at her errant fiancé to a calm respect for honesty in extraordinarily trying circumstances. Sheila's closing speeches in the play see her challenging her parents' smug, inward-looking arrogance, suggesting that she wants to become a more compassionate, sensitive member of society, someone who recognises that there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us who must not be ignored. Whether she'll be successful or not depends on the production and the audience's own response to her. However, it is hard to forget some of her extraordinarily self-centered moans early in the play, bewailing the fact that her special engagement party had been spoilt in such an unfair way. Yet she can be astute and is the first to articulate her sense that there is something different and unusual about the inspector. Very pleased with life. She's got a nasty temper sometimes, but she's not bad really. Good old Sheila. When I was looking at myself in the mirror, I caught sight of her smiling at the assistant, and I was furious with her. With sharp sarcasm. Of course not. You were the wonderful fairy prince. You must have adored it, Gerald. Passionately. You're pretending everything's just as it was before.
Going home is all I've ever wanted, so I can see you once more. Going home, my heart is filled with longing. Going home, the skies are deeper blue.
Oh, watch Susie, she's simply on fire tonight. Oh, they won't boo her off the stage.
Eric Birling, a rapist, messed up, and in the early stages of the play, prior to the arrival of the inspector, a rather ill-at-ease outsider who never quite seems on the same wavelength as everyone else, especially his father and Gerald. There is the sudden, unexplained, peculiarly timed guffaw, possibly due to excessive alcohol consumption. His awkwardness amongst the other, far more assured men. And the occasional abrupt, half-finished sentence. I sense that this is a man with issues, eager to be accepted and loved by his parents, but finds such love and warmth lacking. There are undertones that Mr. Birling, in his eagerness to embrace the higher class Gerald as one of the family, may end up favouring his prospective son-in-law over his own son. And certainly this idea is developed further in the BBC 2015 production, in which Mrs. Birling even says that Eric can't hold his drink like his father or Gerald. This, of course, is an addition to the original text, but there is unquestionably a sense that Mr. Birling and perhaps Mrs. Birling may respect Gerald and enjoy conversing with him more than with their own son. As evidenced by a few occasions when Gerald and Mr. Birling appear to enjoy a laugh at the younger man's expense. Feeling shunned and left out by his father, perhaps, Eric is quick to stick up for Eva Smith, and in doing so directly opposes his father. He points out that it can be difficult for working class people to find employment, and states explicitly that his father didn't have to sack Eva Smith. The inspector's revelations have clearly affected him emotionally. And even if such emotion may be heightened by alcohol, there is no question question that Eric feels devastated by the death of the woman who was pretty and a good sport and was bearing his unborn son. Look at the broken syntax as signified by the dashes and the stage directions of the words on screen. There is no middle-class cushioning within these stark main clauses, just furious repeated accusations and curses. But I'm damned if I'm going to paint Eric as some kind of a victim here. Feeling uncomfortable about the inspector early on, and all too aware that he has committed immoral, almost certainly illegal acts in the recent past. His words as he pleads to be able to go to bed suggest weakness and cowardice. He is honest when talking about the first time he had sex with Eva Smith, yet it is highly convenient that he can't quite remember what happens, whilst the switch to third person in a chap is another way of avoiding taking direct responsibility for his actions. It is tempting to shout out our agreement with his father when he diagnoses overprivilege and being overindulged. The BBC 2015 production contains a ludicrous addition in which a petulant Eric hopes there is a war, which finishes both his parents off, whilst Priestley would never have written such a stupid line. I do wonder slightly about him standing apart and being quite so dismissive about his parents, whilst accepting that their smug refusal to engage with any socialist ideals is infuriating. After all, in the words of the inspector, he did just use Eva Smith for the end of a stupid drunken evening, as if she was an animal, a thing, not a person, who is uneasy sharply. Here, what do you mean? Because you're not the kind of father a chap could go to when he's in trouble. That's why. Nearly at breaking point. Then you killed her. She came to you to protect me, and you turned her away. Yes, and you killed her, and the child she'd have had too. My child, your own grandchild. You killed them both. Damn you, damn you. Just used her for the end of a stupid drunken evening, as if she was an animal, a thing, not a person. I agree with Sheila. It frightens me too.
The sun is at my windows. Going home, the birds sing at my door. Going home is all I've ever wanted.
Gerald Croft. The beginning of the play sees him saying little, but operating deliciously smoothly as the perfect prospective son-in-law. He repeatedly takes pains to agree with his loquacious, pleased with himself father-in-law, and backs him up when he explains his business philosophy to the inspector. He irritates the audience by always saying the right thing at the right time when in conversation with his elders. Indeed, he seems to fit that description of Jekyll in Stevenson's novel as being the very pink of the proprieties. At times, he seems almost sycophantic when chatting to Birling. And the more discerning audience member may wonder what he really thinks about a man who tries so hard to prove his own social credentials. This is a man used to getting what he wants straight away without fuss. Hence his irritation at the failure of the inspector to treat him preferentially and reverentially. And hence his body language as he realizes that he will have to reveal uncomfortable truths about his past. That said, when forced to tell the truth about his affair with Daisy Renton, he gained some credit through his straightforward honesty and clear compassion. He explains, "I want you to understand that I didn't install her there so that I could make love to her. I made her go to Morgan Terrace because I was sorry for her and didn't like the idea of her going back to the Palace Bar. I didn't ask for anything in return." Of course, given the power imbalance between the two, sex did ensue. But overall, the affair was one which brought genuine happiness to the girl. As even the inspector acknowledges. Within this rather depressing landscape, it seems inevitable that men of power and influence take advantage of their position to use women, but at least Gerald does it in a kinder, non-overweight, helpful way. I like the way he refuses to allow Mrs. Birling to dismiss the affair as disgusting, and so shows a degree of integrity and respect for the memory of a woman he once pitied and sort of cared for. Gerald shows emotion at the thought of Daisy's pitiful death. He also has the intelligence to take himself out of the intoxicating, heated atmosphere created by the inspector, so that he can both mourn and remember, but also think. His idea to check whether Inspector Goole was a real police officer is simple but ingenious. But I wonder whether this success, as well as his own smug, invincible sense of his own position, results in his potentially catastrophic decision to ring up the infirmary to ask whether a girl has recently died. Birling clearly has misgivings, but is he blinded by his own reverence to the Crofts family's superior class position to step in, as he might have done if any of his children had had the same idea? The end of the play sees Gerald particularly vulnerable. He has just rung up the infirmary to ask whether a girl has been brought in who committed suicide by drinking disinfectant, and just moments later such an event is confirmed. This, of course, makes Gerald's phone call seem enormously suspicious and opens up the possibility of him being accused of murder rather than just unscrupulous mistress keeping. Given that he previously claimed that everything's all right now, Sheila, and tried to railroad her back into their blissful engaged state, irrespective of his own deceit and cheating, perhaps it is no bad thing this smug twit may have some additional unpleasantness to deal with in the near future. "Look here, sir, wouldn't you rather I was out of this?" "She was very pretty, soft brown hair and big dark eyes." Breaks off. "My God, I've suddenly realised, taken it in properly, that she's dead." To Mrs. Birling, "You know, it wasn't disgusting." "Have you had a girl brought in this afternoon who committed suicide by drinking disinfectants?" "Everything's all right now," Sheila holds up the ring. "What about this ring?"
The birds sing at my door. Going home is all I've ever wanted, so I can see you once more. Going home, my heart is filled with longing. Going home, the skies are deeper blue. And
Watch Susan.
Inspector Goole. Not Poole, as he was curiously renamed within the 1954 film version, has splendid, disconcerting poise when he first enters the House of Smug. He doesn't rush into explaining the purpose of his visits. and uses an impenetrable stare as a weapon to unsettle. Even more unsettling, of course, are his graphic, gruesome, matter-of-fact descriptions of Eva Smith's death. Inspector Goole knows that he is amongst a class of people largely disinterested in the plight of others, and intensely suspicious of anything faintly resembling socialism, and so his aim is to get a reaction and, ideally, by the end of his visit, a more compassionate perspective on the world. As well as staring and using emotive language, the inspector is not afraid to interrupt his social superiors, something they are clearly not used to, and make broader statements about responsibility and class which clearly go beyond the scope of an investigation into the death of a single person. Some of his statements sound weightier and more profound due to biblical allusions. We are members of one body. We are responsible for each other, draws from Corinthians. For just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so it is with Christ. For in one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, Jews or Greeks, slaves or free, and all were made to drink. Whilst, and I tell you that the time will soon come when, if men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish, has echoes of the book of Revelations. The first angel blew his trumpet, and there followed hail and fire mixed with blood, and these were thrown upon the earth. And a third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all green grass was burned up. The inspector is not overtly Christian, but does use these biblical allusions in a bid to propel the Birling family towards recognizing that some things are bigger and more important than the individual, society, community, and to threaten that selfish individualism could have catastrophic consequences for humanity, including them. These religious allusions are aimed at raising the stakes and forcing the family to think more seriously and deeply about their attitude towards others less fortunate than themselves. The inspector's final speech is, of course, deadly serious. However, there are earlier examples of some splendidly dry humour, for instance in his deliberate misreading of Eric's comment following a reference to golf. He is also clever not just in the way he manipulates Mrs. Birling into condemning her own son, but also in his deft use of antinoclasis to throw the family's words back at them, so that they are forced to reassess their own attitude and prejudices. However, it is notable that once the inspector has set up an intense, highly charged atmosphere in which behaviour and attitudes can routinely be challenged, to some extent he's able to sit back and let other family members take on this work. He wants the family members to challenge and confront each other, to come close to violence even, because this is the only way genuine long-term change may occur. Of course, the younger generations are less fixed in their mindsets and are more open to the idea of this change. Whereas with the likes of Mr. and Mrs. Birling, the inspector appears to have had no influence whatsoever. The final twist at the end of the play, as well as the fact Gerald establishes that he was not actually a police officer, begs the question, who or what was Inspector Goole? Well, changing the spelling of his surname to Goole, as in Ghoul, offers one interpretation. Could he be a non-human, supernatural force able to predict the future, in this case the death by suicide of a vibrant young woman? Here's Professor John McRae from the University of Nottingham. He much prefers to see Inspector Goole as a probing voice of conscience. He feels the inspector is undermining the complacency, the self-satisfaction, the false security of this family and their house. McRae is witheringly dismissive about any possible idea that the inspector might represent God. But nonetheless, how would an ordinary human voice of conscience be able to predict the timing of a genuine suicide by drinking disinfectants? Fortunately, I'm not an expert, but I would imagine that this wouldn't be the kind of plan you would share with someone beforehand. If Inspector Goole knew that a particular person was on the verge of committing such an excruciatingly painful act of self-destruction, then he sure as hell wouldn't be wasting his time with the Birlings. My own view is that the twist at the end of the play provides great drama and is intended to make us think. It sees the play moving from realistic drama to something more allegorical. Whereas previously the spotlight was on the gruesome death of a named, indeed multiple named individual, the fact that Gerald has unwittingly implicated himself following his suspicious phone call to the infirmary means that he and the Birling family as a whole may be implicated in the death of someone they may not even be conscious of meeting. And this is Priestley's points. Those of a higher class, and those with the means to do so, need to think far more deeply about the unknown suffering masses, not just those they have had the occasional interaction with. Is society set up to give everyone a fair chance? This more open-ended ending to the play hammers home the point that we shouldn't just be thinking about one abused, tragic individual, but the millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us. She'd been taken there this afternoon because she'd swallowed a lot of strong disinfectant. Burnt her inside out, of course. Cutting through massively. There are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us. We are members of one body. We are responsible for each other. And I tell you that the time will soon come when, if men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish.
With longing, going home, the skies are deeper blue. And
Oh, watch Susie, she's simply on fire tonight. Oh, they won't boo her off the stage.
longing when I'm back at home with you.
Eva Smith doesn't appear in the play, at least the original version, yet she and what she represents is what Priestley wants us to care about the most. As Professor John McRae points out within his lecture Historical Context, Politics and Society in Edwardian Britain, the characters we don't see, the characters we hear about, the victims are every bit as important as the characters we see on stage. Is she one person or a number of individuals? Does she die? In some ways, these questions are irrelevant, as it is what she represents which matters the most. She stands for the millions of working class folk across the UK who are not given a fair chance in life and are taken advantage of by a corrupt, hypocritical, capitalist, elitist framework. The Eva Smith presented by the inspector has arguably more positive character traits than any individual member of the Birling family. She works hard at the factory, sets an example for others, is careful with her alcohol consumption, and hates the idea of burdening or leeching from others. However, she is up against it, living in a ruthless capitalist world without any family to support her. What is clear is that her beautiful appearance and her female gender play a significant role in her tragic downfall. Sheila is petulantly struck by the fact that a particular dress looked much better on her than herself, and subsequently insists on her being dismissed by Millwards. However, she candidly admits that if she'd been some miserable plain little creature, I don't suppose I'd have done it. But she was very pretty and looked as if she could take care of herself. Similarly, part of Gerald's chivalry and wonderful fairy prince act presumably stems from the fact that Daisy was very pretty, soft brown hair and big dark eyes, whilst Eric's drunken insistence on having sex with her highlighted the extent to which he found her irresistibly attractive. Indeed, one wonders whether the first part of Sheila's speech, "If she'd been some miserable plain little creature, I don't suppose I'd have done it," could equally have been uttered by Gerald or Eric, although such an admittance would have uncomfortably confirmed their shallowness even further. So the younger men use Eva Smith for her beauty, and in the BBC 2015 production there is even a faint suggestion that Mr. Birling may harbour similar ambitions himself, whilst the women are prejudiced against her because of it. What is equally tragic and unfair is the fact that Eva steadfastly refuses to manipulate or use others for her own advantage or even her own survival. When inevitably discarded by Gerald, she is very gallant and didn't blame him at all, so much so that he later wishes to God she had. And when pregnant by Eric, she tells Mrs. Birling in her role as chair of the Brumley Women's Charity Organisation that the father was only a youngster, silly and wild and drinking too much. There couldn't be any question of marrying him. It would be wrong for them both. He'd given her money, but she didn't want to take any more money from him. It would be entirely natural and understandable if Eva had put pressure on Eric to marry her, and she would have gleaned an idea of his family status surely during their brief relationship. Yet her insistence on following her moral conscience stands out within the world of an Inspector Calls, and ironically positions her as superior to the Birlings and the Crofts, something the audience understands, but the likes of Mrs. Birling cannot. I've already suggested that it doesn't particularly matter whether Eva Smith is one person or many, given that it is what she represents which is important. In the play, Gerald gets quite excited about the fact that there was no proof it was the same photograph and therefore no proof it was the same girl. However, it is notable that Gerald's Daisy used to work at the factory and also had trouble at the shop, which presumably would be Millward's. Similarly, it seems pretty certain that Eric's lover went to ask his mother for help at the Brumley Women's Charity Organisation, given that she said she had to have help because she wouldn't take any more stolen money, and the girl I knew had told me that already. For what it's worth, my view is that it probably was just one individual. The idea of a new name for a fresh start seems plausible to me, given just how awful each of Eva Smith's experiences were, whilst it is also natural that an expert stage manager and manipulator like the inspector would choose to refuse multiple viewings of the photograph at the same time. The most obvious success of this strategy is that it causes Mrs. Birling to condemn her own son, which would not have occurred had all parties understood simultaneously their role in the death of this young woman. The foreman there told me he was ready to promote her into what we call a leading operator. If she'd been some miserable plain little creature, I don't suppose I'd have done it. And in any case, I don't suppose for a moment that we can understand why the girl committed suicide. Girls of that class. She was very gallant about it. She didn't blame me at all. I wish to God she had now. She wouldn't take any more stolen money, and she didn't want to see me again.
The birds sing at my door. Going home is all I've ever wanted, so I can see you once more. Going home, my heart is filled.
The corner, far from all the bustle and the noise. Somewhere we can walk and perhaps a little talk, like all the other spooning girls and boys. There's nothing quite like slipping round the corner, out of sight of all the ballyhoo. And maybe when we're there, I can show how much I care when I'm slipping round the corner with you. And maybe when we're there, I can show how much I care when I'm slipping round the corner with you.
For the conclusion to this video, I think we need to hear belatedly from the great man himself, speaking in 1944.
Well, I believe that a writer's job now is to try and understand the whole wide social scene, to understand what people are thinking and feeling, fearing and hoping, and then to express as vividly and dramatically as possible that understanding and those feelings. A writer now should speak for the people.
Writing in 1945, just after the Second World War, I can well understand Priestley feeling that people might be looking for a different kind of world, one in which opportunity wasn't denied the majority based on their birth or class, and hence the publication of An Inspector Calls and the unexpected election of the Labour Party. If you have found this video helpful, please do subscribe if you'd like to, or click on the like button or write a comment. My channel, Schofield on Shakespeare, has more than 300 videos aimed at helping students love English literature and language at GCSE and A-level and access the highest grades. For GCSE, do check out my other videos on Jekyll and Hyde, Macbeth, Romeo and Juliet, Great Expectations, plus the language videos giving tips and suggestions for creative writing. Many thanks for watching Schofield on Shakespeare.